Historians, and welcome back to another episode of Historian Reacts. Today I am going to be reacting to season 5 of The Crown. A few tiny little housekeeping bits just before we get started. I will keep it as quick as possible. This is going to be long form deep dive content. If you are looking for 10 things The Crown season 5 got wrong about blah blah blah, this is not the video for you. I will be going episode by episode, talking about what happened in each episode and deconstructing whether those things actually happened or not. I will include timestamps below for each episode, as well as a timestamp for episode 1 if you want to skip all the introductions and the hubbub and whatnot. Season 6 reaction will be coming very soon, straight after this one. Hopefully I will have it up within the next 2 weeks. It usually takes me about a week to watch the series, write notes while I'm watching it, go away and research those, and then write those up into a lengthy script that I can then bring to you. As you can see, season 5's script is hefty. So as I said, it is a deep dive. We do our due diligence and we do our research here. And then once I've got this in hand, I then need to film it, edit it and upload it. So I'm hoping to have season 6 with you within a couple of weeks, because I've got to fit it around work and everything. Thank you to my new subscribers since the last video. I will put your names up and around me. Thank you very much. If you have subscribed and your name is not up there, it is because your subs are not set to public, they're set to private, so I cannot see if you have subscribed. So if you have subscribed and you want to shout out, comment below and I will make sure that your name makes it into the next video. And thank you very much to everybody that has subscribed. I really appreciate it. I will also be placing trigger warnings in a written format before each episode, just so that you know whether you want to skip it or not. But just to let you know before we go in, I will be covering such things as eating disorders, murder/assassination, infidelity, mental illness, divorce, in a roundabout way, child death, unaliving attempts, cancer, drug use, and probably the most egregious of all, Camilla Gates and sexual talk to do with tampons. I'm so sorry in advance. This is as painful for me as it is for you. If you can hear any little noises in the background, that is my lovely little dog Hamish, who up until now has been snoozing very quietly but might decide to make a ruckus. So if you hear any noise, that's Mish, and I apologise. And maybe I'll put up a cute picture on Instagram and pay dog tax as penance. Last things last, no hate comments please about Charles and Camilla. It's not because I have any kind of loyalty to Charles now that he is king, which is very weird to say because the last time I made a Crown reaction video, our dear Liz was still around, so it feels very weird to be talking about her in the past tense. And in this script she might, in fact she probably is referred to in the present tense, because I wrote this when she was still with us. So it all feels a bit fresh, it all feels a bit new. Liz was on the throne for not only all of my life, but all of my parents' lives. So very bizarre. Without further ado, with all that said, let's get on with season 5 of The Crown. Episode 1, Queen Victoria Syndrome. So we have Claire Foy back again as Liz in Clydebank, Scotland, launching the new royal yacht of her reign. HMY Britannia was launched by the Queen on the 16th of April 1953, with the newly married Liz and Philip embarking on their first trip a year later in May 1954. Back to the modern day. It's July 1991 and Liz is being looked over by a doctor. When asked by the doctor if her favourite home is Balmoral, she replies it is her second favourite, the implication being that Britannia is her favourite. As Liz and Philip embark on a trip aboard Britannia around Britain, public polls show that the common people think that the monarchy, especially the Queen, are irrelevant, out of touch and expensive, but look more favourably upon Charles as young, energetic, modern and empathetic. And half of those surveyed would support an early abdication in favour of Charles as king. There's not actually one main poll that was taken around this time that shows such a dip in popular opinion that I could find. I've looked at 3 polls from around that time. The first one, which was reported in the Sunday Times in January 1990, which is, I assume, is the one that's featured in the series, as the staff are trying to hide that particular paper from Elizabeth and Anne. So this Sunday Times one in January 1990 found that 9 out of 10 people felt mainly or very favourably about the monarchy, and that the Queen Mother, Elizabeth and Charles were the most popular royals. It also found that almost half would support the Queen abdicating at some stage in favour of Charles. So not terrible, more favourable to Charles than unfavourable to Elizabeth and the monarchy as a whole, as an institution. Another poll I found from June 1991 found that 81% of people thought Charles would make a great king in the future. The National Centre for Social Research tracked opinion over time on the royal family and found that there was a significant shift in the 1990s over people's feelings towards the monarchy as an institution. They recorded a notable drop between 1983 and 1994 in how many people felt it was important for Britain to have a monarchy, which was down from 87% to 66% throughout that time frame. The general feeling of fondness towards the monarchy were never truly affected in any major way until Princess Diana actually died. I feel like that's important to stress. As for the term Queen Victoria syndrome, Queen Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history before Elizabeth, and Queen Victoria ignored many calls to abdicate the throne in favour of a younger successor as she got older. Insider could find no use of the term Queen Victoria syndrome in common parlance before the writer's room for the Crown. That is a direct quote. Diana, Philip and the boys, William then 9 and Harry then 7, are off on holiday to Italy, which is being marketed to the public as a second honeymoon. So Diana is shocked and annoyed when she arrives at the airport to find Charles has invited his cousin's family, the Romseys, to join them. Their daughter, Leonora Knatchbull, Diana's goddaughter, is in remission from cancer. The holiday is not the second honeymoon that Diana hoped for. While she and her sons want to go jet skiing and shopping, Charles wants to visit historic and cultural sites and rolls his eyes when Diana brings up wanting to go shopping. Have to say, I would be on Team Charles at that point. Controversial opinion, but give me cultural sites and historic sites over shopping any day. According to Diana's private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, this argument did take place, but it was on a different holiday. Charles laments to his cousin Norton about him and Diana's many differences, and Diana is livid when the holiday is cut short because Charles wants to meet the new Prime Minister, John Major. This holiday was taken in 1991 to celebrate a decade of marriage. William and Harry also joined them, and so did Penny Natchbull and her children Alexandra and Nicholas. Diana had already begun recording the tapes for Morton in May 1991, so the timeline is a little bit played around with here. Back over on Her Majesty's Yacht Britannia, or HMY as I will call it from now on, it's clear that the ship is falling apart. Philip calls her an obsolete World War II cruiser with soft furnishings. A clear allegory for the monarchy itself, it seems. The cost of repairs to Britannia comes in at a whopping £14.75 million. As the copies of the Sunday Times are removed hastily, Anne and Liz visit the last manned lighthouse in Scotland, but Anne is too busy checking out equerry Timothy Lawrence. As Prime Minister John Major arrives to meet with Charles, the car radio talks about recession and home repossessions being at an all-time high. This is true. This is off the back of everything that Margaret Thatcher did with the coal mines and many other reasons, but Thatcher has a lot to answer for. Major doesn't want to seem to entertain anything Charles has to say about change and failing institutions needing reform, and asks Charles to be specific in what he's alluding to. A sentiment Charles will not say outright. John Major himself has said this meeting never happened, issuing this statement via a spokesperson. There was never any discussion between Sir John and the then Prince of Wales about any possible abdication of the late Queen Elizabeth II. They added that if scenes in the show implied otherwise, they should be seen as nothing other than damaging and malicious fiction, a barrel load of nonsense peddled for no other reason than to provide maximum and entirely false dramatic impact. Ouch. However, Diana's private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, said that the series, for which he was a consultant, let's just also put that out there for the sake of being fair, he said they made a remarkably good effort. And that he was on the lookout for lies and cruel falsehoods, and he didn't find any. While Jeffson admits that dramatic license was used to condense events or make a direct narrative point, he says that the authenticity in the picture being presented remained true. He did say that the interaction between Charles and Major on the show was not strictly accurate, not because the conversation didn't happen, but rather because the discussion was actually held with a previous Prime Minister. Tea. Tell us, Jeffson. Tell us all about it. So then we have Liz, Margaret, the Queen Mother, John Major and his wife Norma, and they all arrive at Balmoral. Liz asks Major as a formality to approve the cost of repairs to Britannia. Major asks if they can bear the costs themselves, as Thatcher increased the civil lists during her tenure, which was true, which gave the royal family more money than ever before, and that it's a bad time to spark public debate on royal spending during a global recession. Fair point, even if it did come from a Tory. But Liz is having none of it and puts her foot down. Charles, Diana and the boys arrive for the annual Gillies Ball. They country dance and do Highland reels bedecked in their finest tartan. Margaret gives Major a history lesson about the ball. It started in 1852 by Queen Victoria as a thank you to her gamekeepers. Gamekeepers in Gaelic is Gillies, which is why it's called the Gillies Ball. Started by Queen Victoria as a thank you to her gamekeepers and servants, and there's been one every year since as a night for staff to let loose and enjoy themselves. This is true, and something that was not shown in the series is that in 1991, TV crews were allowed to film the Gillies Ball for a documentary called Elizabeth R, A Year in the Life of the Queen. Here are some stills from that footage showing the outfits and the dancing. and I will put a link below to where you yourself can see the footage. After an evening of Philip lambasting Major on the importance of Britannia, Charles tries to dissuade him on the refit. Then Diana confides to him that all the Queen's children's marriages are crumbling and the institution itself is falling apart. Major confides in his wife Norma that the senior royals seem deluded and out of touch, and the juniors are feckless, entitled and lost. He laments that the Prince of Wales, impatient for a chance to rule, does not appreciate his biggest asset right in front of him, his wife. He feels it is all about to erupt on his watch. Liz tucks herself into bed, watched over by a portrait of Queen Victoria. I just want to add very quickly, before I go any further, Liz, calling the Queen Liz. I'm doing it for the sake of brevity, but also it is a term of endearment here in the UK. Our Liz, our Queen Lizzie. So I don't want anybody to be offended on behalf of the Brits, because she is our Liz. But mostly it's for the sake of brevity, because this is a really long script and saying Elizabeth 1,000 times is not amazing. Episode 2, The System. His funeral has the family in tears. Leonora did sadly pass away from kidney cancer aged just 5 in October 19. Charles and Diana were actually on a royal tour of Canada at the time, so they couldn't attend the funeral, but they would have been very upset. Charles and Norton went to Gordonstoun together. Charles was best man at Norton and Penny's wedding, and Norton was William's godfather. So Charles had actually been with the family right before they set off to Canada on the night that Leonora died. Diana attends a hospital, and there are people and there are banners and there are paparazzi everywhere. She confides in her radiologist friend James Colthurst that her recent holiday to Italy wasn't as fun as it looked. Diana did visit St Thomas Hospital, where Colthurst worked, in May 1991, as a matter of fact. Colthurst is approached by Andrew Morton, who wants to write a book about the truth behind the facade of the royal marriage. Philip turns up at Norton and Penny's house to offer his condolences, but Norton is in London. Penny takes Philip to Leonora's grave in the grounds. Leonora was indeed buried in the grounds at Broadlands, and confides in Philip about the state of her marriage to Norton. She offers him a carriage to restore, as she heard he'd found a new love for the sport of carriage driving. Philip tries to convince Penny to have a go herself, and that it may be a good escape for her in her grief. Later in the episode, Penny also visits Philip to pick his brains about setting up a charity in Leonora's memory. Leonora's Children's Cancer Fund was set up in 1994, providing funding to train nurses to care for children suffering with cancer. Philip talks openly to Penny about the loss of his sister Cecily, teaches her to drive the restored carriage, and later Penny tips Philip off about rumours of a book coming from Diana's camp. So, did Philip and Penny Natchbull have an affair? Highly doubtful. I went into a lot of detail about Philip's various rumoured infidelities in season 2 video, so I'm not going to belabour that point over again, but to recap, there is no direct evidence of Philip ever having an affair. There were rumours, and it is quite possible things may have happened discreetly when Philip was on tour that were kept very closely under wraps. I personally suspect what happened on tour stayed on tour, but there is absolutely nothing concrete or even suspicious looking, to be honest. And I dug deep. And also, you think with Philip passing away last year, if anything was going to come out, It might have done, and it hasn't. So, but give it time. Give it time. Maybe I'll do an update video in a few years when the dust has settled. It's also very unlikely that nothing happened between Philip and Penny, because Philip was Norton's godfather and they were also related through Lord Mountbatten, Dickie, who we saw in the previous series, who unfortunately got blown up in his boat. Penny was also 32 years his junior. It would seem that the Queen was equally fond of Penny and they were all really close as a family. Penny Knatchbull did throw herself into carriage racing after the death of Leonora and joined Philip on many a carriage ride, so of course insinuations were made by the press, but on this occasion I think we can safely say theirs was an uncle and niece kind of dynamic. That's what I'm going with. Andrew Morton asks Diana to tape record her side of the story and send the tapes to him via mutual friend James Colthurst, so they'd never have to meet and Diana could deny all knowledge of the book's existence and her involvement in it. She's also offered final approval. Diana wants her story out there but is afraid of starting a war. With trepidation, she starts recording tapes. Diana details her unhappy childhood, raised by a revolving door of nannies, how terrible her marriage was, and talked openly about her bulimia, Charles's affair with Camilla, and her previous unaliving attempts. To help with deniability, Diana provides other sources for Morton to ask about her, such as her therapist, her astrologer, her acupuncturist, etc. Shortly afterwards, Colthurst is knocked off his bicycle by a white van and Morton arrives home to find his house ransacked and broken into. Diana has her house swept for bugs and suspects her phones are being tapped. Philip pays Diana a visit, admitting he shares her frustrations with Charles, but that she needs to keep her mouth shut. They are not a family, they are a system, a well-oiled machine. The one rule is that she remains loyal in public and does not rock the boat. She can do as she wishes privately to find happiness. After the release of the book, Morton is interviewed on TV. The book is a smash hit, breaking publishing records and generating worldwide debate and a media storm. Morton ominously predicts that the family is heading for all-out war. So, what's the truth about the Morton book, I hear you ask? Morton and Colthurst met in 1986 and Morton did cover Diana's visit to the hospital. The pair did play squash together when Morton floated the idea of the book. Morton said, "I was keen to talk to the princess directly, but this was simply out of the question, so I interviewed her by proxy, giving my questions to James Colthurst, who then conducted 6 taped interviews with her in her sitting room at Kensington Palace. She was enormously enthusiastic to have her story out there. She knew exactly what she was doing." Morton would later write, "I'll never forget listening to the first tape, which was in a working man's cafe. All around everyone's eating bacon and eggs, chatting away, and I put these headphones on and turn on the tape recorder and listen to Diana talking about bulimia nervosa, which I'd never heard of, talking about her unaliving attempts, talking about this woman called Camilla Parker Bowles. It was like entering a parallel universe. I walked out of that cafe thinking, wow, what on earth have I heard?" Colthurst, a lifelong friend of Diana's, said about the recording sessions, "I pedalled in with a briefcase in the bicycle basket and, initially I sat and I read out the questions, but that was too slow for Diana." He said, "She snatched the questions away from me and then clipped the microphone onto herself and the tape recorder was on and away she went. What followed was the most incredible outburst of really innermost rage, pain, frustration and anger. You were swept away with it. It was very compelling." Colthurst said Diana was terrified the monarchy would try and have her certified insane and sent to an institution and her children would be taken away from her if she were to speak out publicly. So she had to find a way to get her words out anonymously. Diana did have her office swept for bugs, and Morton's house was broken into and ransacked. The conspirators grew more afraid over the 6 months of exchanging tapes and drafts of chapters. Just before the book's publication, excerpts were printed in the Sunday Times on June the 7th, 1992, under the headline, Diana driven to 5 attempts by uncaring Charles. This word be cropping up a lot right now. Diana, Her True Story, was published in 1992. Upon its release, the book was seen as so candid and sensationalized it was clearly a work of fiction and was banned by a lot of stores. Morton recalled, the book was banned by numerous major bookstores and supermarkets. Ironically, a biography written and produced with Diana's enthusiastic cooperation was being piously boycotted on the suspicion that it was a pack of lies. But it soon became apparent that the book really was, as it claimed, Diana's own true story. Charles and Diana met the day after the book was serialised and decided to go their separate ways. The Queen refused their request for a separation at first, insisting on a 6-month cooling-off period. The book went on to be a bestseller, particularly after the Princess's death in 1997, and is still widely read today. Of this particular episode of The Crown, Morton told Good Morning America, when you see Diana talking, you're really seeing what happened, and she's using many of the words which she sent to me through tape recordings. It left me breathless, and it took me back all those years. I don't say this very often, but I was shaken. I will pop a link below to a documentary on these tapes with interviews with Morton and Colthurst for your own perusal below. Having heard the tapes myself in the research for this episode, here are some of the things that Diana said that stuck out to me. On meeting Charles for the first time, my first impact was, God, what a sad man. My bulimia started a week before we got engaged. My husband put his hand on my waistline and said, oh, bit chubby here, aren't we? And that triggered something in me. Of the wedding day, I was deathly calm. I felt as though I was a lamb to the slaughter, and I knew it, but I couldn't do a thing about it. I couldn't take my eyes off him. I just thought I was the luckiest girl in the world, and, he was going to look after me. Well, was I wrong on that assumption? I learnt to be a royal in 1 week. I was thrown into the deep end. Nobody ever helped me at all. They'd be there to criticise, but never there to say well done. My husband made me feel so inadequate in every possible way that each time I came up for air, he pushed me down again. After fainting on a trip to Canada, my husband told me off. He said I could have passed out quietly somewhere else behind a door. In 1982, 5 months into the marriage, she told Charles how she felt. Charles said I was crying wolf, and I said I felt so desperate and I was crying my eyes out, and he said, I'm not going to listen, you're always doing this to me. He said, I'm going riding now. So I threw myself down the stairs, bearing in mind I was carrying a child. Queen comes out, absolutely horrified, she's so frightened. Charles went out riding, and when he came back, it was just dismissal. Total dismissal. February 14th, 1984, her second pregnancy was announced. The couple had been very close again in the lead up to the birth, closer than they'd ever been. And then suddenly, as soon as Harry was born, it just went bang, our marriage. The whole thing went down the drain. And Charles, all he wanted was a girl. As well as harming her wrists and throwing herself into a glass cabinet at Kensington Palace, I wanted to talk to Charles about something and he wouldn't listen to me, said I was crying wolf. So I picked up his penknife off the dressing table and scratched myself heavily down my chest and my both thighs, There was a lot of blood, and it hadn't made any reaction whatsoever. On William's birth, we found a day that Charles could get off his polo pony for me to give birth. Diana's birth was induced. So that was nice. Felt very grateful about that. Came home and then postnatal depression hit me. Hard. He definitely told her, Elizabeth, about my bulimia, and she told everybody that was the reason why our marriage had cracked up, because Diana's eating must be so difficult for Charles. Even if I ate a lot at dinner, Charles would still say, "Oh, is that going to reappear later? What a waste." Diana went to see an eating disorder specialist and he said, "I can get you better in no time at all. The problem lies with your husband." Winter 1989, after Diana confronted Camilla and the famous "I want my husband" conversation. I said to Camilla, "I'm sorry I'm in the way and it must be hell for both of you, but I do know what's going on. Don't treat me like an idiot." On the journey back in the car, my husband was all over me like a bad rash, and I cried like I've never cried before. And it was anger. It was 7 years of anger coming out. At the time of recording the tapes in 1991, Diana said, "I'm much happier now. I'm not blissful, but I'm more content than I've ever been. Because I've really gone down deep, scraped the bottom a couple of times and come up again." When asked what she wants to do when the divorce goes through, "I think I'm going to cut a very different path from everyone else. I'm going to break away from this setup and go and help the man on the street." Episode 3. Moo Moo. 1946. Edward, the Duke of Windsor, and Wallace Simpson are visiting Egypt, and we meet a young Mohammed Al-Fayed selling Coca-Cola on the streets of Alexandria, where he gains an investor. Over dinner, his father tells him that the British have occupied Egypt since 1882 and aren't thought of very highly, but young Mohammed, or Mumu as his family call him, thinks their godlike status is something to aspire to. He marries the investor's sister and they have a son, Ahmad el-Din Mohammed Abdel Manaim Fayed, or Dodi, which I will definitely be calling him from here on out. Little is actually known about Mohammed Al-Fayed's early life, as he liked to give fictionalised accounts, including that he comes from a long line of wealthy Egyptian cotton growers and was raised by an English nanny. However, these claims, along with the claim that he was born in 1933, were found to have been false per a report from the British Department of Trade and Industry. The report asserted that he was actually born in 1929. His father appears to have been either a school teacher or a school inspector. He married his first wife, Samira, in 1954, and they had son Dodi. During the 1950s, he held a shipping business, and in the 60s, he became an advisor to the Sultan of Brunei. And in the 70s, he moved to England, where he would spend the majority of the rest of his life. And then, 1979, Paris, the Ritz Hotel. Mohammed, with Dodi translating, puts in an offer to buy the hotel, but they don't trust him or his money to be legitimate. However, they take a chance as he's offering a lot more than his competitors. On opening night, Mohammed asks Dodi to fire a man serving champagne. He doesn't realise until later that the man he fired was Sidney Johnson, personal valet to the Duke of Windsor for 30 years. Mo invites him to a meeting where he hires Sidney as his own personal valet to teach him how to be an English gentleman. Sidney imparts all the knowledge that the Duke of Windsor taught him about high society life, and Dodi takes up polo as a hobby at his father's behest. Mo joins expensive members-only clubs and purchases Harrods department store for £600 million. This vast expense means there's very little money left for Dodi to pursue his dream of starting a film production company, unfortunately. He has to prove to his dad it's worth his investment, and he does when both Mo and Dodi are thanked in the speech given by director David Putman when the film Chariots of Fire win an Oscar. Mohammed did acquire the Ritz Hotel in Paris in 1979. He married Heine Wathen, a Finnish model, in 1985, and they had 4 children together. Also in 1985, he acquired House of Fraser, which is the parent company to Harrods, and 100 other department stores for approximately $842 million, which is around £700 million, which is crazy. A series of lawsuits and investigations followed, including a report by the UK's Department of Trade and Industry, which found that the applicants had dishonestly represented their origins, their wealth, their business interests and their resources to the Secretary of State, the Office of Fair Trading, the press, the HOF board, the HOF shareholders and their own advisors. I wrote this a while ago. I'm assuming HOF means House of Fraser, which is a department store here in the UK. I never realised that House of Fraser owned Harrods. I knew the Al Fayed family owned Harrods, which is this big fancy department store in London where I went in there once in the early 2000s and it was £20 for an address book then, which would have set you back about £2 on the high street, to give you an idea of the level of inflation back then. So I just thought it was this really bougie store in London, but I didn't actually realise, because you had like a House of Fraser in every mall, every arcade as we call them over here, but like every shopping centre had a House of Fraser. But Harrods was like a really posh London thing, so I never realised the two were connected. The things you learn. In their bid to buy the House of Fraser, so yes, HOF refers to House of Fraser. Nevertheless, Fayed remained at the head of Harrods for 25 years until he sold off the department store and retired in 2010. In 1981, Chariots of Fire, which Dodie was a producer on, did win a Best Picture Oscar. Mo met Sidney Johnson in France sometime in the late 1970s, and he did employ him as his personal valet. Back to the show, news comes into Sydney that Wallace has passed away and died of heart failure, and that prior to that she'd been confined to her house for 8 years, crippled by arthritis and mental derangement, and mostly tube-fed. She's buried at Frogmore House in Windsor next to Edward. Sydney and Mo visit their former home in France. The house and its contents are due to be put up for auction, including jewellery and Edward's Bureau of Office, which contained sensitive documents. Mohammed buys the house and restores it as a gift to the British royal family, renaming it to Villa Windsor, and invites Liz and Philip to visit the property. Robert Fellows is given the task of going and taking back all important objects for the royal collection, including Edward's diaries, letters pertaining to his abdication, Queen Mary's pearls, and many other sentimental objects, as well as the correspondence from his days in Nazi Germany. Good. Along with his plans to take back the British throne upon Hitler's successful invasion. Yes, we wouldn't want those getting into the wrong hands, would we? Mohammed hands over the diaries and photographs, pleased to have made the Queen happy despite the snub of her not actually attending in person. Sydney has a worrying cough which worsens, and Mohammed nurses him as he becomes bedridden and eventually passes away. Mohammed is very upset, tenderly arranging Sydney's things around his body and later laying flowers on his grave. So, Sydney had started working for Edward, the Duke of Windsor, when he was just 16, and he served the Duke for over 30 years, until the Duke's death in 1972. He was one of the very limited number of people who was actually allowed to attend the Duke of Windsor's funeral. Sydney's wife also tragically died in 1972, leaving 4 children behind for Sydney to take care of. The following year, in 1973, Sydney resigned from Wallace's service after an acrimonious disagreement about him reducing his work hours to spend more time with his children. After the Duke's death, Wallis spent most of her time in her home outside of central Paris on the remains of her husband's money and an allowance from the Queen. The Duchess became reclusive, frail, grief-stricken and unwell, suffering from arteriosclerosis, which I cannot say for the life of me, arteriosclerosis, and dementia, and receiving very few visitors. Over Christmas 1972, she fell out of bed and broke her hip, for which she didn't receive any treatment until the new year. In 1975, she suffered from a perforated ulcer, which she never fully recovered from. After this, her condition quickly deteriorated and she was heavily medicated. And by 1977, she was confined to her bedroom and heavily sedated by her lawyer, Suzanne Bloom, who set about selling the Duchess's possession with gay abandon, including millions of pounds worth of Wallis's jewellery. Historian Hugo Vickers says that by the spring of 1978, the Duchess ceased speaking. She had almost ceased to exist as a person. Wallis could hardly move without assistance. In 1986, the priest who came to perform last rites upon her remarked at how dilapidated and in a state of disrepair the once fine house had become. Wallis died on the 24th of April 1986, and she was buried later at Frogmore House at Windsor with Edward. Later, in 1986, Al Fayed took over the lease on the house from the Duke and the Duchess. The series suggests that it was Al Fayed's idea to restore the once stately three-storey limestone residence, but it was Paris's then mayor, Jacques Chirac, who suggested the businessman assume a tenancy with a nominal lease, sort of similar to the Windsors had done, in exchange for rehabbing the dilapidated 19th century villa. Al Fayed was not only receptive to the idea, but he also proposed keeping and refurbishing the furnishings and art objects, including a disintegrating banner from Edward VIII's brief reign, the Chippendale mahogany table at which he signed his abdication letter, his ceremonial sword, and his polo trophies, which were all set to be auctioned off. 3 years and $14.4 million later, Al Fayed bought the mansion and surrounding 2 acres of garden back to their former glory. He called the private residence Villa Windsor and designated the first 2 floors a museum that he said would only be open to historians, members of the British royal family, personalities, friends, and important guests of the Ritz. So does that mean I can go? Because I'm a historian. Or am I not important enough? What if I book a room at the Ritz? I'm very confused by these rules. The 3rd floor's remodelled 7 rooms were reserved for his family alone. Of their work on Villa Windsor, for which Johnson effectively served as a curator, Al Fayed said in 1986, "Sydney is a dictionary. He's a very cultured man. He's got all of these things out of boxes and safes and storage rooms, and he knows all of their history." Johnson died suddenly in Paris on the 17th of July 1990. Some sources say he was aged 69, others put him at around 66. The cause of death is still not publicly known. He last appeared in public in December 1989 when Al Fayed threw a party to celebrate the restoration of the Windsor's Paris mansion, where Johnson, dressed in red and gold livery, is said to have stated, "I feel on top of the world. The restoration is so authentic. I expect to see the Duchess stepping down the staircase asking, 'How do I look?'" Upon his passing, Al Fayed was quoted as stating that Johnson was truly a gentleman's gentleman, adding, "We shall miss him very much." Mo then sponsors a polo event, so he has the privilege of sitting next to the Queen, but Diana is sent in her stead, where she also briefly meets future love interest Dodi. Diana and Mohammed get on like a house on fire. Looking at them laughing, Margaret remarks, "Out of an acorn of simple kindness a great oak tree will grow." It's thought that Mohammed and Diana met for the first time in 1987 during the Harrods Polo Cup at Smith Lawn in Windsor, where Diana presented some of the prizes along with Mohammed. They may have met a year earlier at a 1986 polo match where Charles was playing on the opposing team to Dodi, though it was probably fleeting. But however they met, Margaret's prophecy, whether actually delivered in real life or not, no one could know quite how true it would become. Episode 4, Annus Horribilis. Liz attends a lunch at the Guildhall to celebrate 40 years on the throne. Margaret wakes at Kensington Palace, applies her makeup and listens to a radio interview she's given that's airing, that discusses her life and her favourite classical musical pieces and hymns. But she refuses to reveal the significance behind the song Stardust by Hoagy Carmichael. An ageing Peter Townsend is also listening in sadness. He's received an invite to attend the reunion of the crew of the HMS Vanguard at the Caledonian Club and invites Margaret to attend with him. It's been 35 years since they last spoke. Andrew pays Liz a visit to discuss his marriage to Sarah Ferguson, the OG Fergie, before the Black Eyed Peas and Fergie. In Britain, we already had a Fergie, and it was Andrew's wife, Sarah Ferguson. So if I start talking about Fergie, I'm talking about Sarah Ferguson. Fergie in the UK, Sarah Ferguson, wife of Prince Andrew. So Andrew pays Liz a visit to discuss his marriage to Fergie, Sarah Ferguson. He'd been away a lot with the Navy and she'd had an affair with a man called Steve Wright. The couple reportedly only saw each other for 40 days in their first 5 years of marriage due to Andrew's naval duties. John Bryan is her latest beau, and there's been photographs leaked of him sucking her toes in Saint-Tropez. The humiliation has Andrew feeling that there's no other choice but divorce. Andrew laments that anything new, original, modern or exciting that enters into the family is quickly stifled and squashed under the weight of the system. Sarah Fergie was indeed papped in 1992 after her and Andrew had announced their separation, I hasten to add. Papped in 92, sunbathing topless, kissing Brian and, yes, him sucking her toes, or kissing them and playing Cinderella, as the pair always claimed. Regardless, Sarah was daughter-in-law to the Queen, and this was a pretty flippin' embarrassing leak, and was certainly what I knew her for when I was a small child. The couple did divorce 4 years later in 1996. Throughout the years, Sarah and Andrew have remained close friends, still living together in Windsor, which is mad, isn't it? Their daughter Eugenie jokes that they are the best divorced couple I know. Sarah is said to be a big fan of the show The Crown, and even joked to Town and Country magazine about her limited presence in the show, saying, "Hello, where is Fergie?" The breakup of Andrew and Fergie in 1992 is swiftly followed by the divorce of Anne and Mark Phillips after 18 years of marriage. She would be remarried to Timothy Lawrence by the end of the year. Margaret replies, accepting Peter's offer, and jokes that she hasn't aged a day since they last met in 1955. At the event, they still glances across the room as Anne and Timothy Lawrence dance. Margaret asks if Anne is in love, and Anne says she might be, but no one approves. Margaret says that is even more reason to pursue it. Peter finally asks Margaret to dance. For a little while, she seems back to the old Margaret, singing show tunes, telling amusing anecdotes, and being the life and soul of the party. Peter tells Margaret he'll be back in London soon, is not getting any younger, and would like Margaret to have the letters they exchanged, so that if anything ever happened to him, he knew they'd be in safe hands. Margaret confesses that she kept all of Peter's letters too. Later, reading over their past letters, she broods on what could have been. So, did it happen? Although Margaret and Peter corresponded occasionally over the years, they didn't actually reunite in person until 1991, when they met by chance at an official function. The following year, in 1992, They met each other again at an official luncheon at Kensington Palace. At 61 and 77, respectively, the pair shared a meal, and afterwards Margaret is said to have noted that other than his grey hair, Townsend was exactly the same as she remembered him. It was the last time they would see one another, as 3 years later, in 1995, Peter Townsend died from cancer. Back to the show. Anne visits Liz to ask if she can marry Timothy Lawrence, because they've been courting for 3 years, but her divorce from Mark Phillips has only just gone through. Remarriage, while the prior spouse is alive, is still deemed a little bit taboo at this point, even though that seems extremely outdated, because I think my parents were separated pending a divorce around 94, so seems a bit weird. But we know the royal family is a bit old-fashioned when it comes to this kind of stuff. Stands up to Liz and said the system has taken enough away from her. She's fulfilled all of her obligations and attended all of her engagements without fuss, and this is the one thing she will do for herself. Charles then visits Liz to demand a separation from Diana after the book release has seen people nickname him Prince Harming. I cannot find any contemporary evidence of this nickname. I looked, I cannot find it. If you can find it, drop me a comment below. Let me know where. I would like to see it. Liz says marriage and producing heirs is vital to the crown and to him, particularly as heir to the throne, and that a happy marriage is merely a preference. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, all this talk of divorce amongst her children is most unsettling. She feels she's failing in her role as God's representative on earth for her country, and she prays daily for their reconciliation. Liz is then informed that a fire has broken out at Windsor Castle in the northeast wing. She heads there straight away to survey the damage, to see fire crews still battling to get the blaze under control, and the whole North Terrace engulfed in flames. Windsor is the home of the Royal Collection. Many priceless artefacts contained within are going up in smoke. Liz watches on as all try their best to save the collection and put the blaze out. Afterwards, Philip and Liz walk solemnly through the ash, rubble and debris. More than 100 rooms, including 9 staterooms, were destroyed. On November the 20th, 1992, the 850-year-old world's oldest occupied castle, Windsor, did go up in flames. It's believed the fire was started by a 1,000-watt light being used in the renovation of Queen Victoria's private chapel, and it malfunctioned and sparked a flame that caused a 19-foot-long curtain to catch alight. An art conservator working next door in St George's Hall, which is a 14th century 180-foot-long banquet room, that was also lost to the flames. He noticed the smell and raised the alarm. The blaze was fought for 15 hours by 225 firefighters, using 35 fire engine pumps to try and douse the flames with 1.5 million gallons of water. Prince Andrew was at the castle when the fire began and helped carry items out of the building. Queen Elizabeth rushed to Windsor to observe the situation, as did Prince Charles. Of great concern was the fate of the precious pieces of art kept in the castle. It was only through great luck and the brave efforts of 325 members of staff that the majority of the collection, which included works by Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Holbein and Rubens, were saved. The beautiful crimson drawing room and state dining room were beyond salvation, sadly. The fire consumed a total of 115 rooms. Restoration of the castle cost £36.5 million and was completed on November the 20th, 1997, 5 years to the day of the fire and on Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip's 50th wedding anniversary. So that's a cute silver lining. The restoration costs should be met by the royal family, said the taxpayers. Occupied royal palaces and items in the royal collection are also too valuable to insure against loss, which is devastating. I work in museums. How can something be too valuable to insure against loss. What's the point of insurance? An independent trust for private donations towards the cost of restoration was announced on the 16th of February 1993 by the Queen's Bank. 29th of April 1993, it was announced that 70% of the cost would be met by charging the public for entry into the castle precincts and £8 for admission to Buckingham Palace for the next 5 years. The Queen contributed £2 million of her own money, and she agreed to start paying income tax from 1993 onwards, making her the first British monarch to pay tax since the 1930s. Whilst getting ready for the Guildhall lunch, the Queen Mother advises Liz not to say Annus Horribilis. It is too theatrical in Latin and will be remembered for all the wrong reasons, and is a proclamation of sentimentality that should not be made public. They don't want to hear that their Queen is depressed. And the Queen Mum may have actually been right in this case, because my own mother referred to 2020 as her Annus Horribilis. We lost my granddad due to COVID and many other things, but we were sat at the table around Christmas approaching New Year, and she said it really has been an Annus Horribilis. So Queen Mum might have been onto something. Liz says it's been the worst year of her life, and she doesn't mind admitting that she's flesh and blood. Philip steps in to say that Liz is in charge and she can say what she likes. She's been dutiful and steadfast for 40 years, and it's their job to support her whatever she chooses to do. When giving her speech at the Guildhall, Liz says, 1992 is a year that I will not look back on with undiluted pleasure. It has turned out to be an Annus Horribilis. In her speech on November the 24th, 1992, Liz actually said, 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an Annus Horribilis. I sometimes wonder how future generations will judge the events of this tumultuous year. I dare say that history will take a slightly more moderate view than that of some contemporary commentators. Distance is well known to lend enchantment even to the less attractive views. After all, it has the inestimable advantage of hindsight. So she didn't say, this has been the worst year of my entire life. She said, in the words of some of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an Annus Horribilis. So she slightly softer, I suppose. But still, my mum said it 2 years ago. So obviously made some kind of cultural impact. The phrase Annus Horribilis was said to her by Sir Edward Ford, her former assistant private secretary, to describe the very tumultuous events of that year. They forced the intensely private Queen to confront very personal revelations about her children and to realise the limitations of royal propriety in modern society. I think it was a very important year in the Queen's life, royal reporter Robert Jobson told CNN in 2002. I think it was the year that she and the people realised that the royal family was not really a family that one should look up to in moral terms. Ooh. Episode 5, The Way Ahead. It's 1989 and Charles is at Eton Lodge and laments being a useless ornament stuck in a waiting room gathering dust as Prince of Wales to friends at dinner. They discuss the good work achieved through the Prince's Trust, and he feels it's one of the only ways he can make his mark on people. The Prince's Trust was founded by Charles in 1976, and it's a charity that aims to help young people aged 11 to 30 to get their lives on the right track. It supports people who are unemployed, struggling at school, or facing issues such as homelessness, mental ill health, or trouble with the law. It runs a range of training programs, providing practical and financial support to build young people's confidence and motivation. And each year they work with around 60,000 young people, with 3 in 4 moving on to employment, education, volunteering or training. In 1999, the charity was granted royal charter by the Queen in a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Charles calls Camilla, Andrew answers, and they exchange tense pleasantries. Charles runs tomorrow's speech past Camilla, but their call is being intercepted and recorded, and it is offered for sale by the Daily Mirror. The paper buys the tape and puts it in a safe, not wanting to be held responsible for the breakup of a royal marriage. 3 years later, in 1992, Charles and Diana are sat in front of Liz to tell her they are separating. Presumably their 6-month trial period that Liz ordered is up, because Liz did actually order that 6-month trial period. John Major reads a statement to the House of Commons saying, "It is with regret that the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. We share the great sorrow that this announcement will cause and ask the public to join us in praying that God will bring strength and comfort to the Prince and Princess. The decision by the Prince and Princess of Wales to separate has been reached amicably. They will both continue to participate fully in the upbringing of their children and will continue to carry out full and separate programmes of public engagement. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, though saddened, sympathise with the difficulties that they have led to this decision." And this statement was made on the 9th of December 1992 and is almost word for word the same. It's just been condensed a little bit for the show. They also committed to attend family occasions and national events together from time to time. Instead of asking the nation to pray for the couple, the real statement asked everyone to respect their privacy, saying Her Majesty and His Royal Highness particularly hope that the intrusions into the privacy of the Prince and Princess may now cease. They believe that a degree of privacy and understanding is essential if their Royal Highnesses are to provide a happy and secure upbringing for their children, whilst continuing to give a wholehearted commitment to their public duties. Liz sheds a tear as Diana moves all of her stuff out and the removal man pack up artwork and boxes. The senior member of the firm meet with secretaries and other high-ranking members of staff. The Lord Chamberlain informs them that he, Liz and Philip have decided to set up an informal council of war, a task force to safeguard the monarchy's survival in a rapidly changing world, calling it the Way Ahead Group. The fire at Windsor, the renovation bill for Britannia, and the failure of so many royal marriages in quick succession have all taken their toll on their public image. And decisions for change include allowing the public into the royal box at the Royal Albert Hall, giving the RAF a more central role in the changing of the guard ceremony, and making bowing/curtsying to less senior royals optional. I didn't get the option to curtsy to Princess Anne when I met her. I met Princess Anne, came to the museum that I was the curator at in about 2015, 16, and we were told to give a little just a little bob, just a little curtsy, little bob. There's only one extremely unflattering photo of me that is all chins from that particular occasion, and I think I am mid bob, but I will include it just so that you can laugh at me, basically. But yeah, I had to scurry forward and do a little bob, and I'm very clumsy and uncoordinated, and I've been called a fairy elephant before in the way I walk and move, so you can imagine how that went. If anyone wants to ever hear a video about what it is like to organise a royal visit to your museum and the strange helicopter ride I got involved in, and the gamekeeper with a gun and all of that, let me know. I will make a video of that. Hopefully I won't get a sternly worded letter. It's all fun and games. Charles doesn't think that these suggestions are anywhere near enough and proposes abolishing the civil list and having the monarchy fund itself, ending the ban on eldest daughters inheriting the throne, and doing more for the environment and disadvantaged subjects, things he's been passionately campaigning about for years, and you kinda have agree with Charlie on that one, don't you? I don't think giving the public the royal box at the Royal Albert Hall is quite going far enough for your PR image. In reality, the Way Ahead group did actually agree to some more radical reforms. According to the Financial Times, the civil list was slashed so that it only provided for the Queen, Prince Philip and the Queen Mother. The Queen agreed to fund the other royals' working expenses herself. The royal family also chose to cover the costs of restoring the fire-damaged Windsor Castle themselves rather than asking taxpayers to step in. Then we have Richard Aylard, who takes a call at Highgrove and then informs Charles that his calls with Camilla were recorded and sold to the Daily Mirror. Uh-oh. The man allegedly stumbling upon the call instead of deliberately wiretapping means no crime was carried out. Aylard says they need to prepare for transcripts to be printed, the recordings to go public, and the contents, though as yet unknown, are said to be of a very intimate nature. Flashback to the conversation as it happens whilst all the members of the royal family, John Major and the rest of the country, are reading that Charles wishes he could be a Tampax so he could live inside Camilla's knickers. Andrew and Diana are terribly upset and humiliated, as one can imagine. The scandal, dubbed Camilla Gate, sees the public lose faith in Charles as heir to the throne and an outpouring of sympathy for Diana. Anne visits Charles, who's hiding in bed with a cold, and says that once she'd stopped feeling grossed out, she was quite touched by how giddily in love he and Camilla sounded. At the next senior members' meeting, Philip gives Charles an absolute bollocking, as we say here in the UK, and reminds him that he's Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Regiment of Wales and their motto is better death than dishonour, before dismissing Charles from the meeting. The Camilla Gate tapes were released on the 17th of January 1993 in the Sunday People newspaper, just 1 month after the Waleses announced their split. Recorded in 1989 when the Waleses were still married, the 6-minute conversation was branded sick by Princess Diana. The transcripts caused shockwaves throughout the royal family as it exposed the relationship between the prince and Camilla, who at the time was married to Brigadier Andrew Parker Bowles. Andrew was actually working away at the time, so he didn't answer the phone to Charles, as is shown in the episode. The official story of the origin of the tapes is that an amateur radio enthusiast accidentally stumbled upon the call with high-tech scanning equipment, but according to the LA Times, given that the tape surfaced within a month of a private call with Princess Diana was captured, which is quickly glossed over in the series, I have to say. Diana was having some saucy conversations of her own that got out there. High quality recording equipment was used. The possibility was raised that the British Internal Intelligence Agencies may have been involved in taping the original conversations, and for reasons unknown they were leaked to the press. Biographer Sally Bedell-Smith said of the prince's reaction, Charles was totally quiet about the humiliating scandal. But the prince did make one change around that time, noticeable to those closest to him. He put a sign in his dressing room that said, "Be patient and endure." And I think that was his mantra. Aylard suggests a TV special where Charles can freely speak, where the public can see him in a more intimate and professional setting and see a day in the life of the prince at work, showing the heir to the throne as progressive, enlightened and forward-thinking, and to hear his vision for a modern monarchy to suit a modern Britain. He proposes the interviewer be Jonathan Dimbleby, a man who may ask difficult questions, but the public trust him and they know he's not a royal sycophant. When asked by Dimbleby if the monarchy can survive after so many recent setbacks, Charles said it can flourish, but it needs to change. and he supports radical reform. When asked whether he was unfaithful to Diana, he admits that once the marriage was irretrievably broken down, old friendships were rekindled. He poses the question, do people want a monarch who can make mistakes, admit them, grow from them and accept change, or one who's content to continue with things as they are and keep making the same mistakes? The interview is generally well received and he's cheered at his next public engagement. Prince Charles's interview with Jonathan Dimbleby was broadcast on ITV on the 29th of June 1994, entitled Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role. It was a 2.5-hour documentary and it was made to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Charles's investiture as the Prince of Wales, and it was filmed over the course of 2 years with 180 hours of footage recorded. More than 13 million people tuned in to watch the future king talk about his children and his faith, his views on architecture, and thoughts that Britain should introduce some form of national or community service. However, it was his comments on the breakdown of his marriage and the charges of adultery that had been made against him in the press that made viewers sit up in their seats as Dimbleby asked His Royal Highness the question everyone had been dying to ask. Jonathan Dimbleby asked Prince Charles if he had been faithful and honourable to Princess Diana, to which he replied, yes, before pausing and then adding, until it, the marriage, became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried. Talking about marriage, Charles also said that its failure is the last possible thing that I ever wanted. I've always tried to get it right and tried to do the right thing by everybody. While Charles did say that Camilla Parker Bowles was a dear friend and a great friend of mine in the interview, it was not until the day after the documentary was broadcast that Richard Aylard, the Prince of Wales's private secretary, confirmed at a press conference that the woman in question with whom Charles was having an affair was indeed Camilla. As you can imagine, fans of Princess Diana were completely incensed by Charles's confession, and newspaper columnists commented that it had done nothing to improve the future king's image with the public. A telephone poll for The Sun found that 2/3 of those who phoned in believed Charles was no longer fit to rule. Alan Hamilton in The Times wrote that the disclosure was not in itself a shock, for the tabloids had been raking the coals for months beforehand. Yet it was a shock to hear it from his own lips, and a shock that he should choose such a public platform as his confessional. Such an open confession of adultery shattered any illusions or sympathy that people had left for Charles. Diana did fight back in her own way by turning up to the Serpentine Gallery's annual summer party hosted by Vanity Fair in an ensemble designed by Christian Stambolian that has gone down in history as the revenge dress. The contents of the interview had been leaked to her a few days beforehand, so she knew it was coming, and she chose a statement dress to wear the night the interview aired. And it had the desired effect, with everyone who saw her in it thinking, what on earth are you thinking, Charles? There isn't a more stunning woman in the world than this. Seriously, look at this woman in this dress. As Sarah Bedford wrote in her biography, Diana, her whole manner radiated confidence. The underlying message was, look at me, look what you've thrown away, and see how much I care. The next day's headline in the Sun newspaper read, the thriller he left to woo Camilla. We then see Camilla being hounded by the press as removal men load her things and she moves out of the house with Andrew looking on from an upstairs window. Camilla did file for divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles in January 1995. Major reports to Liz that cabinet opinion is divided over the interview. Half think he should have kept his mouth shut, and half were pleasantly surprised by his candour and progressive stance. The part where he said he wanted to be defender of faith when he's king, instead of defender of the faith, thereby with that very, very small omission encompassing all religions and beliefs went down particularly well. And he did say that in the interview. And I do believe during his coronation, I can't remember if he swore to be defender of faith or defender of all faith. But he stuck by that in his coronation recently. He did not say defender of the faith. He either said defender of faith or defender of all faith. Anne and Charles talk over lunch, and Anne confronts him on his plans to follow up the interview in a book so that he could talk more about the important things like education, environment, and protecting heritage that got drowned out by all the hoo-ha about adultery. He informs Anne that in the 18th century it was perfectly normal for the Prince of Wales to set up shop at Leicester House to generate fresh ideas and rival courts. Anne shoots him down for criticising Liz instead of supporting her. She remarks to Liz and the family that the Charles she had lunch with was strong, up to task, and in some ways had already begun over the last year at St James's. Charles has been setting up his own court of advisors with a modern progressive agenda. Historian and royal commentator Dr. Ed Owens told History Extra, the court set up by Charles at St James's Palace was not so much designed to rival that at Buckingham Palace, but instead to give the Prince of Wales greater freedom in terms of running his everyday activities. He continued, Charles had carved out a new independent role for himself as Prince of Wales, and this was essentially his way of assembling a team of trusted advisors who could help him carry out his work, free from the oversight of Buckingham Palace. Charles then gives a talk to students on the Prince's Trust and about what kind of king he'll be, saying he may not share their backgrounds or their experiences, but he knows what it's like to be judged, criticised and held back by the things he wants to achieve. The end credit slide reads, Prince Charles founded the Prince's Trust in 1967 to improve the lives of disadvantaged young people. Since then, the Prince's Trust has assisted 1 million young people to fulfil their potential and returned nearly £1.4 billion in value to society. The episode ends with Charles attempting to learn to break dance with the Prince's Trust teenagers, which actually did happen in 1985 on a Prince's Trust visit to Middleton-on-Sea in West Sussex, and I will put the link below to the rather funny video that was taken of Charlie trying to cut some shapes. I'll pop that below. That is, well, I saw it, so you have to too.